Civil disobedience is a serious thing. The rule of law is the foundation of civilization. You shouldn't go around breaking the law knowingly unless you have a really good reason to do it. And I spend 5 chapters opening the book in which I make that case. And they go like this. The Constitution is broken beyond repair. Doesn't make any difference if we get 9 Clarence Thomases on the Supreme Court or 9 Nino Scalias, because their hands are tied by a very untouchable constraint. Namely, if they were to try to reverse the decisions of 1938 to 1943 that fundamentally changed the interpretation of key phrases in the Constitution, general welfare, the Commerce Clause, the rules under which the regulatory state can make up regulations, if they tried to change those, 90% of what the federal government does today would suddenly be unconstitutional. No Supreme Court can do that. It would never be enforced by a president. It would be the end of the Supreme Court. Second chapter, we live under an increasingly lawless legal system. I don't use the word lawless carelessly. At ground level, where we actually live from day to day, all sorts of things that go on do not correspond to our common sense notions of the rule of law, an objective set of things that reasonable people agree we must do. Rather, it corresponds to a complex game that bears little resemblance to the rule of law traditionally construed. Third chapter is the extra-legal nature of the entire regulatory state. I bet a lot of people in this room are as ignorant as I was when I started the book. I was amazingly ignorant about how the regulatory state works. It essentially is as if the police force were empowered to create laws and then to enforce them and to pick the judges and to pick the Court of Appeals. I mean, that's pretty much the way the regulatory state operates, and they make up these regulations independently of any specific mandate from Congress, except we want fair regulations. We want clean air. We want clean water. Fourth chapter, the systemic corruption of the federal government. Not that we have more dishonest legislators than we used to have, but if you look at operationally the way Washington goes about its business, it is indistinguishable from the way a kleptocracy operates. Strong statement. I'll leave it there. Basically, in the first 5 chapters, I'm saying there is no hope of rolling back government through the normal political process. You can get better policies on education. You can get better policies on tax policy, on discrete policy issues. You can't roll things back. So that's when I get to the point of the whole book. Let's have systematic civil disobedience. Let me tell you how the book came to be written, because it's a good illustration of what animated me. My wife and I have a friend who runs a business. I'm not going to go into any more detail than that. The point is, he was being harassed by the regulatory state and fined large amounts of money because he was not complying with various regulations that it was impossible for him to comply with. He was being given competing instructions from the government, and he finally said, I'm going to fight this in court. And the bureaucrat to whom he was talking said, try that and we will put you out of business. Well, when I heard that, as my wife will testify, I was so angry that I actually told her I don't want to hear any more of this because I just can't stand it. And then all at once, I had first an image in my mind. I'm not making this up. This really happened. I had an image. I think he was on a horse in my original image. A guy in a pinstripe suit and a horse comes out of nowhere, taps the bureaucrat in the shoulder and says, we are taking this man's case. We are going to litigate it to the max, even though he's technically guilty of the violation. But in the course of you having to demonstrate that, you are going to wish you'd never taken this on, because we're also going to publicize it in ways which will embarrass your superiors and you. And at the end of the whole thing, when you finally levy a fine on him, we're going to reimburse it. This satisfied me a great deal just thinking of this. And then I said, you can write a book. And so ultimately I ended up writing this book as a way of saying we could systematically do this. If you had a foundation with a couple of $100 million, I'm not talking a little foundation, a place like Institute for Justice or the Pacific Legal Foundation or Competitive Enterprise do wonderful work in litigation, but they are doing selective cases where they are trying to have precedents that affect whole classes of cases. I'm talking about pouring sugar into the government's gas tank. I want to overload the regulatory enforcement apparatus, and I will simply assert right now that apparatus is not nearly as daunting as you think it is. It's daunting when it's directed against a single citizen. It's not an apparatus that can cope with a whole lot of challenges to it. The only way the regulatory state works is by getting overwhelmingly voluntary compliance so that when the regulatory agency says you are in violation of such and such, you owe us $7,500, any smart business person or smart homeowner writes a check knowing that they can't afford to fight it. And I want to create incentives whereby the regulatory state must back off. And I will summarize that in terms of an analogy. Right now, with regard to the regulatory state, we are in the position of somebody driving along the highway at 71 miles an hour when the speed limit is 65, and it's late at night and it's a deserted stretch of highway. We can easily get stopped by a state trooper doing that. You know, he may be bored, he may have his quota of tickets to fill, and he'll do it. The very next morning, as we're driving along a busy stretch of the interstate at 71 miles an hour, 6 miles over the speed limit, you're not going to get stopped because the whole flow of traffic is going 71 miles an hour. The troopers only stop people who are driving crazy fast, which occasionally is me, but they only stop you when you're driving crazy fast or you're driving erratically, and they enforce the law when something really, truly bad has happened. That's the way I want the regulatory state to function. I want them to adopt a no harm, no foul regulatory philosophy whereby they only go after people who've actually done something that's wrong in some genuine sense. Anyway, you got a brick company, and they are being fined. They have railings, but we're in exposed places, you know, above the shop floor, but their railings are only 40 inches high instead of 42 inches high. That's $7,500. They failed to have a sign saying poison on a shed. The shed contained beach sand. But in the list of poisonous substances, OSHA, in its infinite wisdom, has decided beach sand is a poison because in certain grinding operations, it can cause, perhaps, certain kinds of respiratory problems, none of which apply to the brick company. They are told to replace their entire conveyor belt system so it has an automatic shutoff at many thousands of dollars of cost, even though the conveyor belt is already partitioned off from access to people and there's no problem to be done. The OSHA is not going to try for jail time if people ignore those regulations. And part of the Madison Fund that I'm talking about, a key part of it is that it will reimburse people who are fined. And my friend Steve Williams, Judge Emeritus on the Court of Appeals, D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, who's not here tonight, but was really helpful. I asked him, is that legal to reimburse people for these? And he got back to me with, not always it's not going to be, but a lot, it will have to be litigated, but most of the time it is legal to reimburse these things. So people can be made whole in terms of that. They are going to have the hassle of sort of having this legal action done on their behalf, and that's not trivial, but they're not going to end up with a bill.
But what if, if I have my 40-inch railing, which is obviously a sign of anarchy, and the state says I have to raise it to 42 inches, they fine me. I was under the impression that the fine was also in conjunction with an order to raise it 2 inches.
Yeah.
If I refuse to raise it 2 inches, and they say dude, you really got to raise this 2 inches, and I keep refusing it, don't at some point men
some
with
point.
guns come to my house and say you're in trouble?
Let's go to the ultimate aspect of your question. Do you have to have people who are willing to go to jail if it comes to that? And the answer is yes, you do. Then the question is, do we have such people? I don't know for sure that the answer is yes. I get the sense that there are. The certainty of jail, that's a tougher thing. The possibility of jail, I think there are a lot of people who are willing to do that. We will find out, I suppose. But the degree of anger out there, real anger at the way the government is getting in their face when the government doesn't have any business doing there, it's real. You have a lot of really pissed off people.